Welcome everyone to our Mixed Methods webinar with our webinar presenter, Dr. Leah Cain. My name is Juliana Barabbas. I am with the International Institute for Qualitative Methodology, IIQM, here at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada. It is my pleasure to be hosting in conjunction with MMIRA, who have been working with us for a number of years on this mixed method series. And you have a little bit of information there. Dr. Leah Cain has built in some more information about her and what she does. So I will keep that. I will let her introduce herself in just a moment. For those of you that are just arriving, please know that we'll be taking questions at the end of the webinar, and you can type those questions into the chat window. As you can see, many people have already done. Leah, over to you.
Thank you so much, Juliana. Hey there, everyone. I am so excited to see there are so many of you from all over the world. Thank you so much for attending my webinar on ethics and mixed methods research. My goal in this webinar is to give you a brief introduction to ethical considerations. First, just let me say I am a member of the Mixed Methods International Research Association, or MIRA. There are many benefits for joining MIRA, such as those that are listed here. I've particularly benefited greatly from the access to educational and professional development resources, our massive open online courses, or MOOCs, and from the ability to network and gain mentoring relationships with some pretty amazing scholars. While this webinar today serves solely as a brief introduction to ethical concepts, I would like to draw your attention to the MIRA MOOC Season 2, which will become available on April 1st of this year. Along with many other exciting topics, one of the modules in this new season is hosted by Dr. Cheryl Poth and includes a more in-depth, multi-part series on ethics and mixed methods. In her module, she specifically focuses on what the conduct of ethical mixed methods research involves, some of the promising practices in conducting mixed methods research ethically, and how reflexive practice contributes to the conduct of ethical mixed methods research. I joined her for that third piece, which was an exciting opportunity made possible thanks to her wonderful mentorship. I encourage you to join MIRA if you haven't already, where you can learn through our MOOC modules, network with other mixed methods researchers around the world, and gain so much more. Membership within MIRA is incredibly affordable, which makes these awesome benefits even more exciting. So, before we get started, let me tell you a little bit about who I am. My name is Leah Cain, and I'm currently an instructor in educational measurement and research at the University of South Florida in the United States. My overall research interests include examining how researcher identity affects the decision-making process throughout various stages of conducting research, which includes decisions about ethical commitments, like we're going to talk about today. I'm also particularly interested in how our ethical considerations often extend beyond institutional review board approval and oversight, and hope to shed a little light on some of those gray areas that still exist after we obtain consent. I was drawn to mixed methods research personally because it allows us to utilize the voices and stories of those we're working with, while also allowing us to use numbers and statistics, which is so often the language of those in power, to help influence policy decisions. I feel that mixed methods is how we can most effectively use our research skills to make the world a better place. And now that I have introduced you a little bit to MIRA and to myself, let's get started. I'll structure this webinar around our three major goals. First, we'll consider how ethical concerns stretch beyond institutional review board or ethical review board consent. Then I will share the various ways that mixed methods researchers discuss ethics. And finally, discuss how to include our ethical decisions in a final written manuscript. Before we can really get started on this list, though, we need to make sure that we're on the same page about how we're defining ethics. There are a million ways to do this, to define ethics. So let's start by defining what I mean when I say ethics. While there isn't one monolithic definition that really encompasses everything the word means, I'm going to explain it today the way that we explained it in a recent article my team published in the International Journal of Multiple Research Approaches. We quoted Biddle and Schaff from their 2015 work. In Mixed Methods, research via a pragmatic point of view of what works is how they defined ethics. Further, they argued that mixed methods researchers must engage in this definition in order to resolve conflicting axiologies between qualitative and quantitative positions, which we often struggle with in mixed methods. While I like this definition, and I think it's a great place to start, I argue that conceptualizing ethics as pragmatic choices to produce outcomes might obscure the ways in which mixed methods research is shaped throughout the research process. So I think about, what does this definition leave out? And before we approach the question of what is left out, I do want to briefly discuss what is included. There isn't a lot of research or literature out there about ethics within mixed methods research. This is still a field that's definitely growing and will certainly continue to grow. However, we do know for sure that ethical considerations in mixed methods contain the same principles from monomethod research, such as do no harm to your participants, use honest reporting about your data, ensure that you're maintaining data quality and validity measures, and more. I would argue that as mixed methods researchers, we have to meet these ethical considerations for qualitative work, for quantitative work, and then we also have more because we get a little complicated. In Dr. Poth's MOOC, she explores 4 other specific ways that ethical considerations in mixed methods research can be intensified. And I listed them here so you can sort of get a feel for what you can see if you're able to join and participate in our season 2. She argues that mixed methods designs may differ in the number of data collection and integration points. They may use more intensive data collection methods. They may be more intensive over a short period of time, and they may differ in their participant expectations. Each of these 4 considerations, along with ethical considerations also discussed by Donna Mertens, who discusses justice as a core tenet of ethics, often extend beyond the scope of IRB. So basically, after the IRB gives us permission to conduct our research, what else is happening after that point that we still need to consider from an ethical point of view? I don't exactly have perfect answers for this because a lot of people aren't talking about it. And that is, interestingly enough, or maybe purposefully enough, what I want to talk about a little bit next. So, as I continued to learn about ethics and mixed methods, I started to wonder how mixed methods researchers were dealing with ethics within their current work. I gathered a team of other interested researchers, and we conducted modified systematic reviews with a simple random sample that ended up in 322 mixed methods articles that had been published within the 5-year period before the article was written in 2018. After sampling the articles, we read through and pulled out any portion that described the researchers' ethical considerations. We then coded these data and found themes and sub-themes regarding how the researchers discussed ethics. Overall, about 20% of articles had discussed ethics in any way, which is interesting in and of itself because if you think about it, that means about 80% of articles were not discussing ethics, even in a tiny, minute way. This lack of transparency was a little concerning. We, of course, know that everyone must obtain permission from review boards to conduct research. But what else are they doing? And what else are they, you know, dealing with and thinking about? So here are the themes that we found. Our first theme, ethics as defined by the IRB, was broken into 4 subthemes. The largest subtheme, which we called mentioned, occurred when a researcher simply stated that permission had been obtained from the author's IRB without really providing further details. Some examples of this included the simple sentence of, "We obtained IRB permission." We went back and forth with what to call this theme between mentioned and checklist because at some point it just seemed like authors were mentioning it to sort of, check off, yep, we were ethical, we got that permission. The second subtheme under IRB was legal. The codes that created this subtheme were utilized when researchers mentioned specific laws or legal considerations regarding ethics and human participants in their writings, such as, in accordance with our laws in X country, we obtained informed consent from participants. This overlaps a little bit with our third subtheme, which was in itself an informed consent subtheme. And we use this code to describe when researchers specifically mention that. The legal one included a lot more than just the informed consent, such as anonymity. And finally, the fourth subtheme under IRB was privacy. Researchers discussed the importance of keeping participant data anonymous, confidential, and private. So as you can see, there is a lot of overlap within the sub-themes that we found, but they seem significant enough that we wanted to pull them apart underneath this entire IRB heading. Our second theme consisted of instances whereby researchers discussed ethical measures as a source of or as related to data quality. So this included mentions of triangulation, credibility, rigor, and trustworthiness within the discussion of our data, because there are already many researchers that have established time and time again that data validation and making sure that you have good quality data and that you're presenting that data well is an ethical concern. This is sort of a way that we as researchers can keep tabs on ourselves and make sure that we are presenting that good quality data. We're collecting it in a quality way, we are analyzing it in a quality way, and then finally writing it and disseminating it in a quality way. Our third theme consisted of quotations, whereby researchers discussed ethical considerations in relation to pre-established theories or with regard to other researchers. Some of this we really saw in forms of discussing epistemological or ontological views and how that affected the way that the researchers approach their data collection and analysis and administration and all of that. For example, one of the types of things that this code was used on was when researchers would discuss their epistemological stance on constructivism. For example, if you are unfamiliar with a constructivist paradigm, the way that I explain this is that the meaning of qualitative data exists not within me as the researcher and not within the participant, my interviewee, but it exists somewhere in between us, and we have to constantly negotiate what that meaning means. If I were a constructivist researcher, I would take this into consideration, and that would really shape the way that I conduct interviews, which in a mixed methods format would then later potentially, for example, shape the way that I create an instrument to send out and measure quantitative views on a topic. And then finally, our fourth ethics-related theme consisted of codes and theories that centered around justice-related issues, or by doing what is in the best interest of the participants. We were surprised that there was such a small number of articles that were in our sample that specifically looked at this social justice minded ethics, especially given that there's a prevalence of writing on this, especially in mixed methods work, um, such as by Donna Mertens, who is really big on this topic. If you are interested in social justice minded ethics, I highly recommend her work. I'd also like to note, just once again, because this was a very big topic of contention at some research presentations, that we were not looking to pass judgment on anyone or argue that researchers are not acting ethically. We instead argued that it's important to discuss ethical considerations within research, which brings me to the third goal of our webinar today. Let's talk a little bit about why it's important to discuss ethics. Here are some of the reasons why leading researchers in the field are arguing for transparency. Hess-Biber argued that ethics should be centralized within mixed methods research, stating, in order to ensure the validity and accuracy of one's research, it is important for researchers to discuss ethical implications of their research and to remain conscious of moral integrity in their work. Hess-Biber and Levy argued that considering our responsibilities to participants is crucial. They further suggested that researchers consider the following foundational elements before beginning their mixed methods research studies: guiding principles, ethical issues within the framing of the design, the methodological choices of the design, and the sampling procedures, and what responsibility the researcher has toward the participants. Again, this was a big one for us because we have to consider issues such as overtaxing our participants. For example, I think of an instance that Dr. Poff talks about and has talked about in previous talks that she's given, where she considers if we are surveying and interviewing from the same sample, and we potentially random sample our participants from the survey to participate in an interview. Is that asking too much of people? Are we taking too much from them without being able to give back? This also really relates to a lot of critical means and paradigms and epistemologies, as we as researchers are constantly in this role of power. And no matter how much we try to give power back to our participants as a form of ethical action, we're always still going to be the ones deciding, what direction the interview goes in and how much time we're taking up of the participants. And that applies to both the survey and also to an interview or focus group type setting. Others have argued that mixed methods researchers are likely to encounter new ethical issues throughout their research as methodological designs continue to emerge throughout the field, which places an entirely new responsibility on researchers to share their experiences. I'm a big fan of this one, and I'll talk about it a little bit more on the next slide. So, without giving too many spoilers away, I will say that it is incredibly beneficial for early career researchers and for graduate students, and even for, seasoned scholars who have been conducting research for years. It's important for us to know what other people are doing and experiencing and what sort of ethical conundrums they're facing and how they make those decisions. In fact, I would kind of argue that that's a meta ethic in and of itself. If we're not sharing the issues that we've come across, then we're not preparing future researchers to do this kind of work. And since mixed methods researchers are often conducting research that is new and innovative and approaches data in a very different way from monomethod research, we are primed to experience things that others have not. Moving along, Collins' team argued for transparency in mixed methods research, saying that it is imperative to our continued growth and legitimation as a field. Many other mixed methods researchers have also argued for transparency, which is an argument that I hope to continue within my own work. These lessons are not just important for authors, but also for journal editors and reviewers. If any of you are in that kind of position, I encourage you to call for transparency of ethical considerations in articles that you receive to review. So then, let's talk a little bit about how you can include ethics within your own writing. In a way, my suggestion may seem simple, but I argue that it all boils down to choice. This is where I really consider intentionality. Though journals are strict with word count for our submissions, and mixed methods research can admittedly often take more words than monomethod research due to our complex designs, I argue that we will find a space for the things that we value. I think back to what an old mentor used to tell me anytime I was trying to figure out how I was going to approach writing up findings or sharing findings with students. He would always say, not making a decision to include something is making a decision to not include it. So we have to be wary of inaction and of not making up our minds to do something that we believe in. So if you believe in ethical practices of research truly, then you should find a place to include it. When we value ethics and transparency, we can find a way. As I said before, as an early career scholar, I truly value transparency in journal articles because it helps me make more sound decisions during my own research. And similarly, I hope that my transparency in articles can assist other scholars in making ethical decisions within their own work. The easiest way to discuss ethics in your manuscript is to include your ethical considerations when discussing your methods. This is often where we found already existing discussion of ethics in the 20% of articles that we coded for ethical inclusion. So if you haven't seen many examples of this, then I suggest, of course, that you read our article, which is a little bit of self-promotion. Sorry about that. But whenever you're writing up all of your methodological decisions, we're already in the process, or we're already used to explaining and justifying why we chose what we chose for our methods. It's easy to also include a few sentences about what kind of ethical considerations and decisions that you made. For example, what kind of things did you run into? What kind of situations came up that surprised you? And I'm so sorry, I think I'm having a connection issue. Can you all still hear me?
I can hear you, Leah. Are you having trouble forwarding the slide? Yeah, and everyone's saying they can hear you as well.
Okay. Okay. I hear you now. I think I just froze up for a second. Sorry about that, everyone. Um, Sorry, that completely took me out of my brain space. So, I am going to very briefly, just while we're on this slide, bring up a couple of ethical conundrums that have come up in some of the research that I've been doing, just to let you think for a couple minutes. These are situations that have been changed and anonymized a bit, just so that way nobody can find out where they're coming from, but just some food for thought. So, first one, in thinking about sampling strategies, you decide to conduct a mixed method study on breast cancer survivors to examine how they chose which providers and treatments to pursue. After surveying 500 individuals, you decide to randomly sample from the survey respondents in order to conduct in-depth interviews with some participants. As I mentioned before, this sort of overtaxing from your same sample can be very difficult, especially when given a very difficult topic, such as working with breast cancer survivors. This can be triggering for them to first fill out a survey. They can already, feel very triggered and emotional about that. But then to be asked to come back and interview or participate in a focus group can be re-triggering. And so we really have to weigh the risks and benefits of this decision. And this, just like the other two scenarios I'm going to tell you about, doesn't really have an exact answer yet. But it is something that we have to be aware of. Our next scenario comes from doing online-based research, or specifically, in this example, Twitter-based research. So think about this. Your team of researchers has decided to utilize Twitter data about the upcoming presidential election in the United States to see how individuals in different parts of the country feel about the candidates. You're using a program to download all publicly available tweets from different geographical areas, and then plan to use software to count the occurrences of candidate names being used. You will later examine the tweets for individual meaning. So, if we think about this from an ethical perspective, there are multiple pieces to consider, multiple things at work. And using social network data is becoming more and more prevalent, especially within mixed methods research. So we have to think about, just first the ethicality of using this data in general. Is it, truly okay to use this data? Who does this data belong to? That's one of the questions that I ask my students quite often. Who does this data belong to? If someone has publicly tweeted out these feelings, does that mean that the data now belongs to everybody and can be used? Or does it still belong to them? IRBs, at least in my experience so far, and in the experience of those that have shared this concern with me, haven't really figured out where they stand on the process of informed consent in regard to publicly available social network data. I've heard from some people that their IRBs are requiring informed consent, and I've heard from others that their review boards are not because it is technically public data. And then just the idea of mapping this data to examine those geographical patterns that I mentioned can also bring up the ethicality of providing monolithic experience claims. So, is everyone in this certain part of the country that is tweeting about this certain candidate really portraying the depth of perceptions and knowledge within that area? You have to be careful about how you're making those claims.
Leah, just very quickly, are you still on the how I can include ethics slide, or have you been going forward?
I am still on that slide.
Okay, fantastic. Sorry to
Yes,
interrupt.
that's okay. Thank you for checking. All right. And then finally, I have one more scenario for you to consider, and then we are going to bring it back to that slide. So, you and your research partner, Elena, are conducting a study on how students with disabilities access resources on college campuses. Elena is very vocal about having a disability and shares this information with participants during interviews. So I'll give you just a second to think about this one. This scenario in particular brings in the idea of researcher identity and reflexivity, which again, Dr. Proth will talk about more in her module in season 2 of our MOOCs. But in thinking about how your research partner, Elena in this case, is outing her identity as someone with a disability, what is that going to do to the participants? One of the critiques here, I think, can be likened to the critiques against the romantic interviewing style, if any of you are familiar with Kathy Ralston's different interviewing profiles. And is basically that, is this manipulation? Are we telling the participants things about ourselves only in order to get better data from them? How will that affect the way that we make instruments moving forward if this is an exploratory design where we are starting out with qual and then continuing to quant? And then how do we include these issues of researcher identity within a final write-up? Each of the examples that I've provided to you today, again, don't have exact answers to them. Ethics is such a gray area, and we're all still learning exactly what we should be doing and how we can approach it. So, again, I argue that all of this is about finding a home within your methods and making those justifications and deciding how to best approach these topics and then sharing those approaches with your readers. Transparency is everything in research. And with that, I would love to take any questions that you may have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Leah, so much for that presentation. I have had some questions that have come up in our chat window, the first of which likens back to your reference to social justice minded ethics. You mentioned a researcher, Donna Martin or Donna Martins. Can you give us the spelling on her name, please? Leah, you were on mute for a moment.
Yes, it is Mertens, which is Mertens.
Is that M like Mary or N like Nancy at the beginning?
That's M like Mary.
Thank you so much. We've also had a question come up on the chat window. Seems like there may be some ethical dimensions in the expectations of quantitative and qualitative members of a mixed methods team. For example, is there always equal representation in the design process for the study?
That is a great question. And since there are so many different ways that we integrate data and that we approach mixed methods, this can certainly be a sense of tension and of ethical deliberation within a research team. I, for one, am thinking of an example where I tend to prefer strong qualitative mixed methods. So I put a lot more emphasis on the qualitative portion of my personal research designs most of the time. I was recently working with a team member who preferred strong quantitative methods and valued the generalizability aspect of quant more so than the in-depth exploration of qual. And so we did have a bit of tension there about how to figure out the best way to design the study and what kind of ethical considerations would be at play if we did a strong quant or a strong qual study. I, unfortunately, I don't think that there is an easy way to figure these things out other than just talking it out with your research team. And certainly working with research team members can always be a little bit more difficult than working alone, especially if you have competing axiologies or paradigms or epistemologies. And I see ethics and researcher identity, which is a part of ethics, as completely tied up in that conversation. So while we don't always give quant and qual equal representation, even when we do, figuring out where your team members stand as far as how they value knowledge and reality and ethical decision making is imperative.
Thank you. I was about to call you Kathy, but there was a question about Kathy Ralston. So sorry, Leah.
It's
Um,
okay.
uh, I will note that we had talked about, Leah and I had talked about forming a PDF if we run out of time on questions, but there has been a question around Kathy Ralston's citation. What was the piece that you were referring to? If you can share what the citation was from her.
Absolutely. Kathy Ralston, or Catherine Ralston, I believe she uses her full name on the book, has published a book called Reflective Interviewing that is big in qualitative circles, but I haven't heard as many people within mixed methods discussing her multiple approaches to research and to interviews. The book, again, is called Reflective Interviewing. It is not very expensive and it's a quick read. It's very accessible. I am happy to provide all of my citations to Juliana later so she can include them on the PDF.
Thank you so much. That we'll be sure to do that. And then there was another question on the authors, so that'll get covered off when we include those mentions in the PDF. From Gloria, are customers slash patients always included right from the beginning?
It depends. Um, I honestly think a big weight on answering that question is your ethical commitments and, again, your paradigm and your epistemological beliefs. I know that whenever I'm conducting research, I try to include participants, patients, customers, whoever I'm working with, as early on in the process as possible. Of course, you do need to obtain ethical review consent first before you start interacting with potential participants. But as soon as that process is granted, I immediately hit the ground running to work with people. Part of that is because of my personal beliefs about performing critical research and trying to give power back to the participants as much as possible. Others leave the participant interaction until they are totally ready and everything is completely in place. And I definitely do not feel that my feelings on that matter are more valid than others. I think that we all work within research spaces in a way that makes sense for us and that may not make sense for everyone else.
So our next question actually, I think, relates a little bit to your last statement. Ethical commitment is largely affected by the identity and/or convictions of a researcher as well. To what extent can IRB serve as a filtering or protecting mechanism of some ethical issues?
Oh, that is a great question. Um, in my personal experiences with IRBs at the institutions where I have worked and conducted research, I have found that they tend to be very positivist or post-positivist leaning and tend to leave out the question of researcher identity and convictions. And so if I could redesign the IRB, I would absolutely have them ask researchers, what are your philosophical viewpoints? Why does this topic matter to you? Because I don't personally believe that you can separate yourself as the researcher from the topic. That's a very common belief in qualitative research, but it's not one that we tend to embrace very much in mixed methods, in my experience, and it's definitely not one that is tended to be embraced in quantitative methods, as the goal is so often to eliminate bias and to produce instruments that will eliminate error as much as possible. But if we're thinking about being truly effective mixed methods researchers, that means that we really have to embrace both quant and qual considerations in ethics and reflexivity and reflexive practices and and just in-depth investigation of our own beliefs is so important in qualitative research. And I would really like to see IRBs and more mixed methods researchers interact with that concept. And I hope that answered your question.
Tamrat, who asked the question, says thanks. So it appears that yes. We do have another question from Susan. How do you protect the identity of an institution under study if that is the only institution in the neighborhood?
That is hard, especially if you are really examining like a cultural, geographical aspect of that institution. I recently had a student who asked me a similar question because they were working with an institution that was not mine, that was in a place that was very small and only had two institutions. And they were trying to figure out, how do I ethically approach this conversation when a big driving factor of what I'm doing is cultural, and a big piece of that culture is tied to geographical location. So, what I suggested that the student do was that they lower all of their numbers to make sure that the institution could really be either one of those two or any in the surrounding area if they decided to not include the state, for example. And I'm trying to keep the situation as anonymous as possible. But between the two institutions that were covered within that geographical area, one, let's say, for example, had more than 40,000 students enrolled, and the other had about 20,000 students enrolled. I told the student to, wheel it back and say, you know, 18,000 or more students are at this university. So I think that it's all about just lowering your description of the institution to the lowest common denominator and then saying, this or more. And they have programs such as this and others, and just try to keep it as anonymous as possible that way. It can definitely be hard though, especially when you're working in underrepresented neighborhoods and areas.
Thank you so much, Leah. I see Susan is typing another comment. And are there any other questions? Please, if anyone has any other questions. And Susan says, thanks. Appreciated the response. Just give people a chance here if they have more questions. And we've got multiple attendees who are typing. So and Susan was saying she could also widen the geographical area. Thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Some of the research that I have done took place within certain areas within what we in the United States call the Bible Belt. And instead of naming those specific states, I widened the geographical area to say, these institutions were located in the Bible Belt, which includes these states.
Quick question from Tamrat. Uh, Leah, do you have your contact information included on your next slide? And if not, are you okay with building that? We could build that in when we provide the PDF.
I do not, but I am absolutely okay with including that on the PDF.
And to Stephanie's question on emailing the PDF, no, we will not be emailing the PDF. However, on IIQM's website, on their Mixed Methods Archive tab, you will see not only, it'll take about a week to get all the components up, the video, the slides, and any other questions. And actually, we can probably tweak the presentation PDF for the references. But all of our mixed methods going back to 2013. All of those presentations are available with slides and videos. So please do check us out at that IIQM site on the University of Alberta's website. Any other questions from anyone? Is there any? I don't think I've missed any in the chat window. We'll give this a second. Many thank yous coming in. I'm going to take the liberty of just forwarding a little bit. If there are no other questions by the time we're done, a few other mentions, then we might wrap up for today, if that's okay, Leah. We have our next Mixed Methods webinar coming up on March 9th. This is, I believe, a first for Mixed Methods. Dr. Jose Louis is doing an introduction to Mixed Methods research in Portuguese. So registration, as usual, can be through our website. We also, as I mentioned, have archives available, and there is the if you go to the University of Alberta website and search IIQM, you'll be able to find our webinars Mixed Methods archive tab. As I mentioned to a few of you at the top of the hour, we also have through IIQM our Thinking Qualitatively conference coming up this year with a focus on intersectionality as a sister stream in partnership with the Research at Intersections of Gender Signature Research Area. We encourage you. Registration is open. Abstract deadline is coming up mid-March, so it's fast approaching. Please visit our website for more information on that, and we look forward to seeing you June 15th through 19th. I will also mention we have some innovative new offerings in terms of software training, in addition to a full day of training available on June 20th, Saturday, June 20th, just after the official conference ends. We've invited our certified trainers to do one-on-one consultations. There's just a limited number of these 1-hour consultations available. They're at a very reasonable rate of $175 Canadian per session. So I encourage you to check that out if you have specific questions. It's a great opportunity to sit down one-on-one with an advanced in vivo or Atlas TI trainer in order to get some of your questions answered. We also have our IIQM faculty coordinator, Dr. Karin Olson, who is available for similar consultations one-on-one around qualitative design and methods. So great opportunities for those of you that are able to come to Thinking Qualitatively, and we look forward to hearing and seeing from you all. So I'd like to thank Dr. Leah Cain again for that wonderful presentation. If any of you do have any other questions, again, we're going to be building in a citation slide and a contact slide into the PDF of the webinar presentation before it goes out. And please feel free to either write myself or Dr. Cain with your questions if, as I see, that it doesn't look like we've had any others that have come in. So, Leah, is there anything you would like to say before we sign off?
Thank you so much to everyone who attended, and thank you for your excellent questions. I've had a great time. Sorry, I got a little derailed there with freezing up for a moment.
Well, and thank you for being a trooper, Dr. Cain, and powering through on that. I know it can be disconcerting, so thank you for continuing and giving us that lovely presentation. Okay. Thank you, everyone. We look forward to seeing you at a future presentation. And again, I will send